Welcome back. And now in this video, we come to one of the major historic incidents in the Roman history that we've been surveying in these videos, and that is the First Triumvirate. The Triumvirate was a pact among the three figures that I have mentioned several times in the previous videos. We have Pompey the Great that you heard about in the previous video. We have, of course, our famous Caesar. And then we have this fellow, Marcus Licinius Crassus, who in his day was one of the wealthiest figures in Rome altogether. We therefore have Pompey, who has a lot of the military success. We have Caesar, who is from a relatively distinguished family, a patrician one, but one that has not been able to aspire up to the position of consul prior to Caesar himself in 1570 BC. And then finally we have the very wealthy Marcus Licinius Crassus. So what is it that brought these three men together into this union? As we talked about in the previous video, Pompey the Great had thought he had managed to put together a relatively good relationship with the Senate, only to be disappointed in 62 BC when he was effectively denied a triumph for all of his big military successes, especially over Mithridates, that he had scored out in the east. The Senate refused to honor Pompey's reorganization of the cities and provinces out in the east after his military successes out there. So that essentially separated Pompey, at least for the time being, away from the optimates in the Senate and drew Pompey and Caesar closer to each other. Crassus also joined in, even though he was himself an optimas, because Crassus valued the kinds of politics that Pompey and Caesar themselves were putting together, and himself had quite a few misgivings with individual senators. And so Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus, despite their rather oddly matched backgrounds, ended up forming this alliance. And it was formally put together in 59 BC, even though it really had been in the works for a few years before that. I should also mention that a further incident prior to this had brought the Senate into further great difficulties, and that had to do with one of the senators who attempted to put together a major conspiracy to overthrow the Roman government, and that was the very famous Catiline. Catiline himself was an aristocratic senator who, in the consulship of 63 BC of Cicero, the orator Marcus Tullius Cicero, had been caught attempting for the few years before that to organize a major plot to attack the city and take over the government. In 63 BC, the year of his consulship, Cicero was able to gather together enough evidence to show the Roman Senate what Catiline had been up to, and eventually Catiline was disgraced, went out into exile, and was finally defeated in battle. Students of Latin usually get exposed somewhere along the way to at least one, maybe four of the famous orations of Cicero against Catiline, denouncing him first to the Senate and then to the Roman populace. However, this conspiracy had further shaken confidence in the Senate as a ruling body and was probably an additional factor leading to this particular triumvirate. Now, it's important to explain that the term triumvirate is not actually accurate to describe this particular grouping. Technically, a triumvir in Latin, meaning one of three men, is a formal obligatory alliance that essentially divides up a particular country or nation or such into three groups. This did not actually happen in this case. This was simply a meeting of the minds that these three men eventually put together. However, because we do have the truly formal triumvirate that comes up later with Octavian, Lepidus, and Mark Antony, to distinguish this group from the later group, we use the rather awkward term First Triumvirate, even though that's not actually what this particular arrangement was. What ended up happening was that Caesar, directly after this, moved up north in order to deal with a crisis up in Gaul that involved a group of people called the Helvetians. The Helvetians were located initially in the landlocked area directly north of Italy, where Switzerland is today. And they decided that they wanted to move further southwest because of the isolated region. And they needed, in order to do that, they needed to cross Gallia Narbonensis, the Roman province, and they asked for permission to cross. They were denied such permission. The Romans did not believe that the Helvetians should have been given the opportunity to move where they wanted to, which was along the Pyrenees Mountains between what's now France and Spain, because the Romans feared, among other things, that the Helvetians might possibly be in a position to organize some kind of a border attack against the Romans. So the Romans denied that permission, and the Helvetians moved there anyway. And therefore, Caesar went up to stop them from doing this. That led to a battle in between the Romans and the Helvetians. And then, once they were defeated, Caesar ended up moving further into Gaul to try to secure any other allies of the Helvetians. What ended up happening over an 8-year period from 59 to 51 BC was one of the most impressive conquests that the Romans carried out anywhere in their republic, soon to be empire, and that was the conquest of all of Gaul, as well as the southern portion of Britain, and even a little bit of Germany, although eventually that would not hold, and also setting in motion the process of moving over west into Spain. So this was another one of these groundbreaking military efforts by the Romans to essentially pick up this entire new province, and obviously this is to be credited to Caesar. Meanwhile, Pompey moved back east, and Crassus stayed in Rome for a while, and then eventually Pompey returned, and Crassus was the one who eventually moved east. So this was originally a very well put together arrangement, and in order to seal the deal, Pompey married Caesar's daughter Julia. And it was not uncommon for political deals of this nature to be secured with a marriage. Well, this went fine for 5 years, from 59 to 54 BC, when it would have been renewed. But in 54 BC, Julia passed away. Unfortunately, to make things worse, in 53 BC, which is really the year where the Triumvirate is formally broken off, Crassus, over in the east, ran into military trouble with the region called Parthia. And in fact, in the following year, 52 BC, he finally was defeated in a major battle out in Parthia, in which not only was he killed himself, but quite a few of the members of that of those 3 Roman legions were also killed. And the standards that were carried by a member of the Roman army called the Aquilophare, which means literally the eagle bearer, those 3 standards that represented symbolically the arrangement of the legions were all captured by the enemy. And the Romans had to go through a pretty considerable process, which finally culminated with the efforts of Emperor Augustus to finally retrieve those 3 lost standards. So with all of that, the first triumvirate that started off pretty solidly together with camaraderie for about 5 years deteriorated. Now, one of the difficulties that happened with Caesar was that, ironically, the wonderful success he had up in Gaul actually wrecked his reputation down in Rome with the Senate, who began to see him as potentially a much too powerful figure. Eventually, the Senate came back around to Pompey and persuaded him to abandon Caesar's cause, especially after the death of Julia, and to make a union with Pompey instead. So Pompey finally did turn around and turn out to be an optimus after all, abandoning his former status as a populist. And once Crassus himself was lost, the formerly okay relationship between Caesar and Pompey simply fell apart. Now, by 51 BC, when Caesar finally finished the conquest of Gaul, Pompey was firmly now allied with the Senate. The two of them had made a rapprochement, and now Pompey was essentially turning against the cause of Caesar. Now, while Caesar was up in Gaul, Caesar had possession of an army. Now, it was still a standing rule in the late Republic that any politician was not allowed to have a standing army in Rome itself. So even with the expansion of the potential for private army ownership that had gone forward under the consulships of Marius, that was still not allowed. In addition to that, we now come to back to that civics problem about imperium. Remember that imperium was not allowed to be possessed simultaneously in Rome and in the provinces. If you were in one or the other and you moved, you had to give up the imperium that you had previously. After 51 BC, Caesar wanted to return to Rome in triumph and stand once again for the consulship. Pompey and the Senate, however, opposed his doing this unless he disbanded his army and gave up the imperium that he had held as a general abroad from Italy. It was this moment, finally, in 49 BC, after several more failed negotiations, that finally prompted Caesar, famously at the southern edge of Gaul, to cross the Rubicon River, one of the tributaries of the much larger Po River that separated Gallic territory from Roman territory. Caesar crossed this river. That's the phrase in English, he's crossed the Rubicon. In doing so, Caesar violated the decree of the Senate, as well as standing Roman practice of disbanding one's army, and thereupon Caesar declared civil war against the city of Rome and Pompey. It turned out that when Caesar did this, he had quite a bit of loyalty with his own soldiers and with quite a few other soldiers in Italy, and he was able, therefore, to amass a much larger group of soldiers. Eventually, this larger group was able to stare down both the Senate and Pompey, and it caused Pompey himself to flee, and for Caesar to finally approach the Senate, himself now to make a rapprochement. As a result, once again, the Senate declared an SCU and gave Caesar dictatorial powers to go after Pompey, now declared the public enemy of Rome. Once that happened, Caesar chased Pompey off into Greece and was able to defeat him in 48 BC at the Battle of Pharsalus, Pharsalus. Once that happened, Pompey fled to Egypt, where eventually he was hunted down and assassinated. Caesar chased him down there, but Pompey was already dead by the time Caesar caught up with them. And that ended up being the end of Pompey the Great, and that left Caesar in sole charge of power. Now, Caesar, of course, is the only remaining of these three triumvirs, and it somehow worked out once again that the temporary dictatorial power that Caesar had got turned into a position of perpetual dictator, just as Sulla had. So now we have a situation in which Caesar, that is a single leader in Rome, now has all the power. It's unchecked. The Senate cannot do anything short of assassination to stop him. And Caesar starts making big plans to move back to the east, to go, I should say this way for you, to go after those lost standards, as well as to commit Rome into several other plans of military expansion. This ends up not sitting well with the Senate, and the Senate, which had briefly been in a state of rapprochement with Caesar when he returned into Rome with his big army, now finally does in fact turn fatally against him. So, in our next video, we will approach the rather ticklish matter of 44 BC, the Ides of March. We'll see you next video.